Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipsson. Welcome to episode 111 of Sports Management Podcast. Before we start, I have checked the podcast statistics and 40% of you who listen to this do not subscribe to the podcast. So please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It will help the show grow, and the bigger the show, the bigger the guests. Thank you. Now, today's guest is Nicola Wilburn-Shaw, the co-head of sports law at JMW Solicitors. Nicola, or Niki, is a lawyer with great experience from family law and later on fell into sports, where she has represented high net worth clients in family matters. She also has a great passion for female representation in sports, something we will discuss at length in this episode. Get ready to learn about how Niki fell into sports law, why she and her daughter are doing boxing, the lack of research of women in sports, the need for more female voices, the very small percentage of women on boards, and much more. Nicola Wilburn-Shaw, welcome to the Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you, Marcus.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm here in a grey Manchester, which is the norm for us. That's our standard summertime.
Yeah, same here in Sweden. We have the same type of weather. I know exactly what you talk about.
First and foremost, get that out the way.
Exactly. So when you're not outside, in the grey weather, you are working as a lawyer. You are a co-head of sports law, also at JMW Solicitors. So can you tell us a little bit about your role and what it is that you do?
The co-head of sports is a recent appointment. Happened at the beginning of summer for me. I'm traditionally a family lawyer, which encompasses anything from disputes relating to children, so contact disputes or relocation, divorce, prenups, postnups, cohabitation agreements, unmarried couple property disputes. So it's quite wide ranging. I fell into sports, I think is probably the best way to describe it, by accident. And I'm going to talk a little bit more probably about that later on, I hope. I've never really been your typical sports fan, I don't think, until probably the last 5 or so years, when my family practice started delving into the sports world, particularly football. And I acted on a big case that involved acting against the owner of a football club, who himself was in some high court proceedings for unfair dealings. And at that point, I obviously had to get au fait very quickly with the accounts for football clubs, how that world works, in order to be able to advise my client on what she was looking at in terms of the family process, but also how I had to take that case strategically to get from A to B. And from that experience, I guess my interest was sparked. I started watching the games more. I got more interested in football, and it was stemmed from there, really, more than anything. From then, I started to get more clients in from the football world as opposed to acting against them. Clients in Premier League footballers, international footballers, so Champions League, and it just kind of progressed and went on and on from there to the point where I now have acted for not just players, but coaches, managers, operational staff within football clubs. And Stephen Taylor Heath, who's my partner in crime or partner in sports, who's my co-head at JMW, asked me if I would help spearhead the team with him, really, based on the fact that my practice in matrimonial was developing kind of a niche in the sports world. And the networks that I was moving in terms of clients and the work that I was doing in the sports sector, particularly women's sport, caught his and I guess various other people's attention. He did make me laugh at the time. He described it as hoping that it wasn't going to be similar to when Roy Evans made Gerard Houllier co-manager of Liverpool FC, and he was subsequently sacked after 6 months. So Stephen's still going strong. I think his job is safe.
That's good to hear. And for those of the listeners that hasn't listened to that, Stephen Taylor-Heath has his own episode that they can listen to after this one, because they should not yet jump off this one, because we have so much to talk about. You mentioned it there, a lot of work also in sports, but outside of sports with family law. And then you said you fell into it. And so when you were working with you said Premier League players and so on, was it in civil matters, like family matters, or was it also pure sporting legal matters?
No, it was completely family law. That is my practice. My practice is family law for the sports industry, because there are distinctions within the sports industry that set it aside, in my view, to your traditional family law. And it arguably should be its own discipline of practice, if you like. In family law is a generic principle. But you will have international practitioners who will know international law, or you will have, for example, a specific specialist area of family law is what we call a farming case, because they have their own kind of set principles that go around giving that legal advice. And you have to have the knowledge and skill set to be able to advise on those sorts of clients when you're dealing in that. And that's what I realized within family law, is that, actually the sports industry is, you're dealing with actually quite a wide range of different types of financial disclosure that wouldn't necessarily apply in family law. For example, you're dealing with image rights companies. You need to be able to have an eye on developments in the law. I mean, one analogy that I've been able to kind of talk about vocally more recently is, of course, the changes with the football agent regulations and the caps on fees. And, whilst controversial, and I'm sure there's probably another podcast somewhere about the temporary injunction in the German domestic courts on that. And that's not for me to talk about. But certainly as a family practitioner, you would need to be alive to that, because, of course, if you're dealing with a player over here where those regulations do now apply, if you were acting for an agent, for example, when we give financial disclosure, which is the only way and means that the courts can determine what would be a fair settlement in a divorce, we need to have financial disclosure. And we do that by what's called the Court Form E. And the Court Form E asks you to disclose your last 12 months of income, expenditure, your bank statements. Now, of course, if you are now an agent at this side of the coin, this side of the regulations, your income is going to be probably disparagingly different now that there's a cap on the fees that you can have for player transfers. So you would need to be alive to that, because otherwise you're going to be giving a completely inaccurate, to the detriment of your client, financial picture. Likewise, for the players who now have to pay those fees net of their salaries. So they're already taxed on that at source. And there's just a whole different arena, really, that you need to be alive to. It just simply doesn't fit into a one size fits all. Family law arguably doesn't do that at all. And that's why the very nature of the court system can sometimes be described as the Wild West by practitioners who are used to a bit more rigidity in their profession. But certainly the sports arena is something that can be completely different.
I'm sure. And I mean, the difference of working in sports is, now you said that you represent football players. They are usually very high profile and most people know about them. So when they go through a divorce, it's different than if your, next door neighbor is having a divorce. So it's more sensitive, I guess, in a way. And also because it's high profile, you don't want information to leak, and then there are rumors and so forth. So how is it to work with more high profile cases?
Dealing with high profile cases, whether it's a football player, any sports person, or a media personality, I've worked with lots of people who are on the television, or just any sort of, media persons, music people. You need to, again, have someone who's got that skill set, who's going to recognize, as you quite rightly say, yes, all family law proceedings are sensitive, because you're talking about the most personal of relationships, of your finances. We're talking about your children, your income, your romantic side of life, whatever that might look like to you and or your spouse. So you need to make sure that, for me, I always engage reputation management lawyers on board straight away. We have people that we can work with, third parties that are involved with various things that go out on the internet. We can look at dealing with injunctions. So it's really important that you've got someone who can act fast, because that can also have a detrimental effect way past the divorce proceedings, dependent on what you're dealing with in terms of the facts as to why a marriage has broken down or how a party's behaved, could impact on their career on the pitch, as well as this being their, your personal life, what's going on with you behind closed doors. So it's really important that you've got that person who's there to guide you and steer you on that. I'm a huge fan of the prenup for that very reason, because within a standard prenup, you should always be thinking, particularly when you're dealing with a high profile sporting individual, about an NDA clause being put in that prenup. So whilst you can't guarantee that, sometimes your nearest and dearest might be people who leak information to the press, but what they can't do is leak the contents of what you've decided within your divorce and what that prenuptial agreement says is going to happen. So it's all about that experience, that skill set, and making sure that you are not just focused on this is a divorce, as a general family law practitioner might do, and just focus on the law and the outcome. It goes way further than that in the sports profession.
But that can also be sensitive, I guess, also in the case with a prenup, because it's, you're securing your possible divorce in the future. And how do you have that dialogue? And especially with some athletes or sporting people, that they earn a lot of money. So is that something that you said that you are in favor of the prenup? Yes. But is that something that maybe not everyone is so pro prenup?
I think traditionally there was a reluctancy on prenups. at the start of the year, I had a tremendous number come through within these were Premier League players that I've traditionally done prenups for. And they tend to come, I would say probably 90% of the prenups that I've done for players have come via either an agent or their IFA, so their wealth manager, who recognizes that, hang on a minute, we have to have a look and a think about this. You can take a pessimistic view on them, of course you can, but ultimately no one walks down the aisle thinking they're going to get divorced, do they? But when you're dealing with the sums of money that are in question for a successful professional footballer, it's something that does need to be thought about, because ultimately marriage is a contract. It's a legally binding agreement that you're entering into with another person. And you wouldn't sign for a new club, would you, without lawyers poring over your contract and your agreement and what your remuneration is and what they're going to do for your family. And, what bonuses are you going to get, or what will happen to you if you don't perform? So really, it is essentially the same. It's entirely that. It's another business transaction. It's another contractual agreement.
I understand. Obviously, you're a lawyer. I've been to law school. But how did you end up with family law? Was that something you also, like sports, fell into? Or is that something that you actively wanted to work with?
No, family law was something I actively wanted to work towards. That was never a stumbling into like the sports remit was for me. I think I like to think of it more as fate rather than falling into. I think really when you find that thing that you're passionate about in life, it's true what they say, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And that's really, really important. You have to be passionate about what you do, especially when it's such an intense and high pressure job, like the law. But family law, I went through an extremely acrimonious divorce as a child, which saw my parents split up during the 80s and 90s in a very, thank goodness we've moved forward from those times, is all I can say about that. But it was something that really impacted on me as a child, and the things that I saw and the outcome of that, and just the aftermath of everything. So I always felt quite passionate about maybe having a voice, I think, through a child's eyes at that point. But it's now shaped me completely into the practitioner that I am today.
That's Understandable. And also really, I think that must, show in your work as well, that you're really passionate about it and firsthand experience of what it means to go through a divorce. And I guess you take with you your own experiences into your work and use that to your benefit.
I absolutely do, yeah. And I think in family law, the most successful practitioners have the best level of empathy, and that's usually because they've either been through divorce themselves or as children. Because it is, as we've said, we keep using the word sensitive and personal, but it really, really is. There is nothing more sensitive and more personal. So you have to have that empathetic view set of, you have so many hats as a family lawyer. Honestly, it's you're a lawyer, you're a life coach. You try not to stray into the remit of being a psychologist as well, but sometimes that's inevitable, that you have to kind of give the whole pep talks and this is happening because of this and let's look at this. So it really is a role that requires so much more than just knowing the law.
On the topic on sports, you have a passion for women's sports and women in sports. So
yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what it is that you work on that, or your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on women in sport, I'm hugely passionate about equality in all walks of life. And that comes from gender equality, racial equality, disability equality. Everybody deserves that equal right and that equal opportunity. We are all born essentially the same way, or slight variances, but we're all born the same way. We all deserve those same opportunities. The women in sports thing has kind of come from me, I guess, taking up sports roles myself. I started boxing last year, women's boxing, and I guess having that legal mind, I'm naturally inquisitive to know the background and the history of these kind of concepts. And it's only when you open your eyes and look around that you do become acutely aware of, hang on, I'm the only female in this gym, or I'm the only female in this meeting room, and I'm surrounded by, what are predominantly white middle-aged men. And then I want to know why. Why is that? What is the reason and the origins behind that? And then naturally, just this inquisitive nature that I have got me delving further and further into it and thinking, wow, something really needs to change here. Something drastic needs to change here. And I'm a manager in my role. I manage a team. I look at it in terms of the responsibilities that I have to my juniors and the opportunities coming up through the law firm. And when you look at the sports world, participation in women's sport is at an all-time high. I think it was FIFA who put that on their website not too long ago. And it's absolutely right. Ever since Euros 2022, record viewings, all of that, it has quite literally gone off, and not before time, really. When you look at some of the stats that have come out of the Women's World Cup tournaments that's been going on, this summer with the speed of some of the goal kicks that have gone on in comparison with the men's game. And I think men are starting to take notice as well and sitting up and thinking. I've spoken to various males within the industry who have said, yeah, I saw that headline and my initial reaction was, that can't be right. And that struck me, why can't that be right? And that's what we're dealing with in terms of, that's just the society norm. It's not because anybody has got a discriminatory outset or is looking down on females or taking this misogynistic approach. It's just been the society norm, and that's what we've been up against. And when you go back to the fact of 50 years since the FA didn't officially ban the women's game in England, but they said it was actively discouraged, so let's call it what it is. So we've come an awful long way from there in terms of participation. But for me, what I like to be quite active on is that we've got more participation in women's sport at professional level than we ever have before. We've got, you've got all these arguments around investment going into the game. How do we do that? What happens with that? Now, for me, I'm thinking the real problems here lie at the top. in terms of what's going on in the boardroom, what's going on with these big key decisions in women's football. We've still got an absolute gross underrepresentation of females in the boardroom. England Sport did the whole let's try and achieve the 30% target to work towards that. And there were only 3% of clubs that actually achieved that level when they did their last research on that. I read something by Governance in Sport, I think it was, that said, 1 in 10 board seats are female in those highest generating of football clubs. And if you contrast that with the 40% of the FTSE 100, that we're so far behind in football, so far behind. And when we've got this new emergence of women's football, particularly over here in England, where people are starting to take notice, they're starting to realize, hang on a minute, this could be a profitable venture for us. And let's be honest, business is about generating revenue, isn't it? This is what we're looking at. This is what people are seeing, and they're taking notice of, oh, I might want a little piece of that pie. What's crucial for us is the fact that the Deloitte Football Money League, I don't know if you're familiar, they basically look over the 20 most high revenue generating clubs, and they do a review each year on, what's gone on, what predictions there are. And for the first year, for 2023, they looked at the women's football. Now, Manchester United, where they generated €6 million for their side of the game, which you think, oh, that's quite good, €6 million. That's actually 0.1% of Manchester United's overall revenue, which is minuscule. But then the flip side of things, €6 million isn't an amount to be particularly sniffed at. What's crucial now is that we don't just look at, what certain people are saying, we need to keep this momentum going. I disagree. We need to keep aiming higher. We need to build. We don't need momentum. We need to build. We need to keep going and keep going. And the way we do that is by taking that revenue and reinvesting into the game. But that will depend upon commercially sound strategies being decided. That's where we've got issues, because we don't have enough women in the boardroom. It's not about doing the right thing. It's not about, let's let the girls have a go. Let's have gender equality. For me, it's about recognizing what women can bring to the boardroom. I read a Credit Suisse AG report, which showed that over a study that they did of Fortune 500 boards with a higher percentage of females, those outperformed those without in a 53% return on equity. I mean, that's huge. Women obviously have a proven diversity of thought. There's certain arguments that have shown scientific research into us being better decision making. When it comes to we talked about empathy, women naturally may have a greater degree of empathy, which is crucial to change any organization, any structure, and to arguably being less afraid to confront or show some vulnerability. But then that key thing in football clubs, stakeholder representation. If we've got women, female stakeholders, and we don't have enough girls in the boardroom, it's a recipe for disaster.
Of course. And the business case for women's sports and women's football, soccer in general is huge. And I mean, it's not by accident that if you go back now, my latest 10 episodes, many of them have been just around women's sports and women's football, because not only the World Cup is going on right now as we speak, but also, like you see, I mean, the attendance records feel like they break every month. Yes. More and more. And as you said, with the speed of the kicks on the goal kicks, and the game is getting better, it's getting more interest, it's getting more sponsors. So it's just a super interesting field, if you want to call it like that, but the women's football. But also, as you said, that of course that if the women's game is growing and you don't have women representation on the board, then that's a mismatch.
It is a complete mismatch. Ultimately, any operation that has a stakeholder interest needs to make sure that those stakeholders' expectations and what they're striving for, that those needs are matched. Otherwise, they're going to go elsewhere. And that is what we need to be so focused on here, as opposed to, I'm not saying we've reached what we need to do in terms of participation. We haven't, and that's a whole separate discussion, going as far back as grassroots and what we do on there. But we have an opportunity now here for the women in sports movement, particularly in football, where we are on the cusp of something that could be amazing, but it's going to rely on, like in any business decision, sound commercial decisions being made at the top.
Except for the representation, what are some other issues that you see with women's sports, and maybe specifically in investments?
I think it's the broadcasting. I think it's a big issue for women's sport, because of course that's where the majority of money is made in the men's game, through sponsorship. When you look at Sky, TNT in the UK, the level of money that's ploughed into broadcasting for the men's game is toe curling. The Women in Sport 2017 research revealed that of all sports coverage here in the UK, only 7% of that went to women's sports. That was 10% in TV, 5% in radio, 4% online, and an absolutely mediocre 2% in newspapers. If we're not reaching those broadcasters that we want to make those big commercial decisions to buy into our game, we either need to really start thinking outside the box, and it's an uphill challenge. But what we need to do on that, in my view, is it's positive intervention. We've got a collective responsibility here. And when I talk about a collective responsibility, I mean that we have to have our three governing bodies in England, the FA, Premier League, the English Football League. We all need to be working with women to say, here we are, this is what we're going to do. Karen Carney, MBE, released her findings in July this year, where she talked about how there's got to be some urgency brought into, I'm going back to the board here, so you can tell I'm passionate about that, but there's got to be an urgent addressing of the inequality there at board level and going forwards, and how, she's recommending certain things that need to be done on that. So we're never going to have absolute parity with the men's game in women's football, which we're talking about mostly here. But I don't think that's really what we want. And I think our message needs to be clearer on that too. We're creating something that is the opportunity for us to get right all the things we got wrong, maybe with the men's game. There's so many different reasons why women watch football as opposed to men. Obvious one, gambling, huge industry when it comes to sponsorship in the men's game. I don't think you would find anywhere near the level of females gambling in the sport. That's why they would go. They go for active enjoyment. It's seen as more family friendly. You don't have to worry about missiles being thrown or certain words being heard by your 6-year-old that you might prefer that they didn't if you're in the stands watching a women's football game. So I think we need to collectively deliver what the message is with women's sport, target those that are important, but we need the support of the governing bodies behind us fundamentally.
That's a really good point. And also, I spoke to Karen Dobrace from Lewis FC recently here, and she was talking about that also, that the women's fan is different. They go for the games for different reasons. They want to buy different things in the cafeteria. So when we look at the men's and women's football as the same, and we just try to copy from the men's into the women's, I think we're doing it wrong. I think we need to see them as two different products, and how can you maximize each of these products. And you mentioned, for example, the broadcasting, because a critic usually says that the men's game generates, there was some, I don't remember the exact numbers, so don't quote me on this, but like the World Cup, the men's game was 6 billion and the women's game was a couple of millions, whatever.
Yeah.
And then of course they are paid more. But also if the women's game don't get, as much broadcasting, and the broadcasting companies don't invest in the women's game, of course there will be less sponsors because they have less screen time. And I mean, it's just this circle. So
it is, and it's not a virtuous one.
No, exactly. So exact to your point that with the women's game, there's obviously an interest. So just giving them the screen time, giving them the opportunities, and I'm sure that it will skyrocket more than it has already.
I think so too. We've got to get it right, though. We've got to get it right. And I could talk all day on this subject, Marcus. So I'll pause there.
All right. So let's move then from football to boxing, which you said that you're also working in, and you also did some boxing. You went to a gym, you say. So you have also seen some, issues with that sport, and specifically from a women's perspective. So what is on this topic? What is your view on the boxing?
It's another issue really with gender equality. Boxing has been traditionally seen as a very macho sport. It's a combat sport. I think probably all combat sports have been seen in that way, martial arts, but certainly boxing. I mean, the idea of two women in a ring punching each other just doesn't sit well with a lot of people. But when you look at boxing as a sport and a skill, and all of the benefits that boxing gives to your mental health, your physical well-being, and especially like young people going into the sport. My daughter's just turned 9 and she loves boxing. She trains with the same PT as I. He's a former professional boxer. And before I met him, I didn't know much at all about boxing, really. I was a fan. I watched it growing up with my dad on TV, and that was the beginning and end of it, really. I was inspired. I was watching female boxing last year. I watched the Alyssa Baumgardner fight, and I just thought, wow, imagine the training that they must go through, for the physique that they have. And I thought, I wonder. And I found my trainer, who, as I say, he himself is a former professional boxer, and he's got a backstory of his own. At 23, he had, I hope I get this right or he'll kill me, 10 straight wins, including 4 knockouts. And he had an extremely promising career ahead of him from that reason. But he, obviously, each time you renew your license, you have to undergo the medical, and his scans showed signs of CTE, the chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And that was it. That was the end of his career. And at 23, everything he'd worked for he was boxing from being a young child. It was all he'd ever known. Suddenly, his world was flipped entirely upside down. And that was it. He had gone from having big promoters offering him a lot of money to do fights. And, he had what he thought, rightfully so in his mind, a really good career ahead of him. And that was it, gone, over. I got to talking to him about that, because I have some strong contacts in the PFA. And obviously, there's lots of scientific research that's gone behind, for example, heading the balls in football, various foundations that have been set up. And unlike football, which has the PFA, or golf that has PGA, the rugby league's got the RFU, the Rugby Football Union, nothing exists for boxing at all. Nothing. There is issues with insurance. They have no pensions. When a situation like that happens with my trainer, that's just it. You're just done. That's it. Over. Go find your way doing something else. And that, to me, really, really shocked me quite badly, because I thought, my gosh, when you look at the traditional routes of people that go into professional boxing, they do tend to come, and I hope I don't upset anybody again, but they do tend to come from a less privileged background, do we want to say, working class. And, education isn't necessarily something that they have access to. So this is the road they go down to build their career, they build their discipline, and then all of a sudden it is gone. And that just shocks me to the core. And I think that with boxing, it's self-regulated, isn't it? Which it can be a good thing, but it can also be chaotic. And I'm far from the anti-boxing brigade. I love it. I love the training. I have a lot of friends that are former boxers or current professional boxers, but something needs to be done here to set something up around that and remedy all of that. But from a girl, which is what you asked me originally, I think I touched on it briefly at the beginning when we talked, that there have been plenty of times where either I have been there in the boxing gym or my 9-year-old daughter, and certainly I'm yet to see another girl my daughter's age in that boxing gym. And she has said to me, Mummy, do you think, when can I spar? I mean, aside from the fact I'm like, whoa, kid. This was purely to teach you discipline, mental and physical health. I'm not sure how I feel about this. The fact that if I supported her doing that, and I'm not going to delve into the moral arguments on that and get an inevitable panning from the parent brigade, there is no one that she could spar with, because there are no girls for her to do that with. There are plenty of boys her age that she could spar with in that gym, but there are no girls. And I think that, again, we go back to looking at the history of women's boxing, which will come probably as no surprise that I did. And you go back, and actually boxing was illegal for females until Jane Couch MBE challenged the British Boxing Board of Control in 1998 to grant her a license. 1998, that's not that long ago. Yet it took us 24 years for Natasha Jonas to be the first female boxer of the year by that very same BBBOC. So what does the landscape look like for women's boxing? We've got a lot of focus on women's football, women's rugby, cricket. What about women's boxing? What's happening there? So we've got some really good fighters. I went to the Boxer Fight Night last month, I think it was, which was supposed to be the Eubank Smith rematch, but it ended up basically being headlined by the women fighters. And the skill there by Savannah Marshall and Natasha Jonas, outstanding. And it was a great watch. I mean, boxing, we watch it because it's entertaining, isn't it? I mean, it's all very Vegas. It's a show. They put on a show, and it was fantastic. And again, I think if we don't pay some attention there to what's going on, we're missing another big revenue opportunity as businesses. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating to see this happening.
Yeah, of course. And I watch not so much boxing, but more UFC, so mixed martial arts. And Ronda Rousey was the first big name there. And that was in the 2010s, something like that. I think that before that, there was no women competing. And now they are headlining events after event. So to your point, but do you think that you said in the boxing gym, there is no one that potentially could spar with your daughter? Is that because they are not welcome, so to speak, in the gym, that they don't look for girls? Or is it that it's maybe parents that they have this, or they look at the history and women are not supposed to box, for example?
I think it's certainly, speaking from my gym where I train, I've been a member of many gyms. I've been one of those yo-yo dieters, joins in January, finished by March. I've been with this gym for best part of a year now. I love it there. It's certainly not the former when it comes to them. I think it's most definitely the latter. It's a societal expectation. Most people are shocked when I tell them that my 9-year-old daughter does boxing training, or they'll make a joke, if I had a pound for every time I heard someone say, oh, no one's going to mess with her in the playground. I mean, obviously there's an element of truth in that, I hope, which is for self-defense. Well, why wouldn't you want that for your daughter? But I think it's a societal norm. It's something that people don't think is open to girls, or whether girls should do it. Again, I think it goes back to, like I said, about women's football. Positive activism is what we need, and a collective approach. I think, could the gym do more? Possibly. How would they go about it? I don't know. But there is certainly something that can be done. And there is certainly something when you look at, for example, I gave the reference to the Boxer Fight Night with the girls headlining. There were a lot of people there that night in the AO Arena in Manchester, and a lot of them were men too.
I'm sure. So going back to the Players Association, that there are no PA, what can be done there? Because again, referencing UFC, there was some players that they tried to make that happen. I don't think they did it very successfully, but there could potentially, I mean, how do you start a PA? How do the players start that up, or the boxers, to get their own association, to someone to vote for them?
Well, that's the challenges that are faced. And I think arguably does some of that come from the backgrounds that we're talking about, possibly. So therefore, is there an onus perhaps on the promoters? What you need to look at this more closely, which is something I've done over the past year or so. I've read a lot of books and I've read a lot of case law and tried to come to my own conclusions about what that trajectory might look like if you were going to achieve that. And something that struck me was I read a book by Jack Anderson called The Legality of Boxing, A Punch-Drunk Love, I think it's called. And he makes a really interesting suggestion there, saying that basically what boxing needs is to have the Boxing Board of Control. Now, I don't want to upset anybody there, but to have an independent body called the British Boxing Association, for argument's sake, which would be led by a nominated, appointed, voted in CEO who would be answerable to, say, the government sports minister at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And they would focus on, education, personal development, making sure that there are provisions for insurance, pensions, unions. Now, you've got to be careful here, because what you don't want to do is take boxing the other way, insofar as people think, oh, this is not something we want to be involved with, leave it alone, don't start messing around with things. And I can't push hard enough. I am not in the anti-boxing brigade, far from it. I love boxing. I'm passionate about it. I'm passionate about watching it. I'm passionate about what it contributes to society. My daughter, physical, mental health, all of that. But we have to be really careful that, we don't end up in a situation, for example, where we think it's just accepted. We've got this immunity. Take fox hunting, for example, in England. That was an age-old tradition, which was arguably had more socioeconomic values within it, that now completely illegal. It only takes for that one extreme injury leading to a fatality. Let's hope we don't have that. But if that comes, is boxing going to stand up to the abolitionists and the medical associations that say, hang on a minute, there's exploitation here, or we've got issues here insofar as where the sport is going? And I don't know the answer to that. Nobody does. So I think if we can gear it up to be the professional sport that it is, to have it aligned with football, with cricket, with golf, with rugby, that can only be of benefit to everybody, the promoters, the boxers, the fans.
Definitely. And such an interesting area, and a lot of potential.
There is. And I should probably caveat that by saying these are all my personal views, because, of course, Stephen does a lot of work in boxing, and he will be saying, he might have different views to me on that. But these are my personal opinions based on someone who, not even looking at it from a legal point of view, really. I'm looking at it as someone who participates as a woman in the sport, who is at, if you'd like, on the shop floor with the boxers. I see it, I hear it, I feel it. And these are the thoughts that I have, and the ideas and the trajectories. So I don't know. We'll see.
To be continued.
Yes.
Moving on to some other topics that I'm interested in. You were accepted, I guess you say, to the VSI executive education course on a scholarship as only one of two females.
Yes, that's right. I'm very proud about that too.
As you should. And can you tell us that don't know what that is a little bit more about it?
So VSI executive education is an institute that was set up by Tony Faulkner and Andy McIntyre, who between them have, probably 50 odd years experience in the sports sector. Tony in elite performance in sport, and Andy was traditionally a reporter. Actually, I think he was with the Mirror Group and the BBC, and he ended up having an executive position with the Gold Partnership, I think it was, or the Gold Group, with David Gold, the co-owner of West Ham. And they basically set up the organization to bring about an industry-specific training program for sports executives. So what that did was similar to what we've been talking about insofar, what next? What happens next? Post-playing career, maybe, but to really get the best of the best leaders sitting at board level. They launched a scholarship program with Siobhan Chamberlain, who former Lioness, for 2 females to undertake the course in a drive to help the mission with female representation at board level. And I was asked to apply and thought, oh, okay, I probably won't get that, but why not? Passionate about the subject. I like learning and I like new challenges. So I thought, well, okay, hey, let's give it a go. And went through the application process, had a very long meeting. I think it was about 2 hours, and got offered one of 2 spaces, and absolutely delighted to do so as well.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
So what do you feel like this has given you so far?
Oh gosh, so far, apart from, the growing my network, which some of the cohorts that I'm with on the course are former players, current directors, CEOs at some of the big clubs already that are doing bits there. The network's been, oh gosh, incredible. I feel humbled to be on that course, I think, and with a little slight smattering of imposter syndrome when I first walked in, and then thought, come on, nope, you've earned your stripes. Let's get on with it. What it's done for me so far is really given me insight into the analogies with how my legal practice and my legal career is quite analogous with what goes on in the boardroom, and that kind of lateral thinking. But what it's done is give me strategic leadership skills already that I have taken away and really reflected on myself and what this means insofar as what being a good leader is. We all know there's a distinction between a manager and a leader, but how do we get to that point? And that's what this course has done. It's been so insightful in terms of we've done some practical work where you're assessed and you'll set a particular case study and they will just watch you in a group setting. So obviously they're looking for natural leaders, but that's not to say that you're going to be better than everybody else, because what they're doing is working to your strengths and your weaknesses. So it's been really insightful so far, really insightful. I'm very excited about the next module.
I'm sure it sounds really, really interesting. And building on that, this course, your experience in law, in sports, and your legal background in general, what is some advice that you would give women in the sports industry?
Use your voice. 3 little words. Use your voice. If people aren't listening, try to talk a bit louder. Shout if you have to. If they still aren't listening, look at why. Often we fail to deliver our messages because we're not really aware ourselves of the content of what we're trying to communicate, and we're not focused on the delivery of that. Something the VSI taught me on the first module that we did was the concept of windows and mirrors. And we're all really good at the former. We're all really good at looking out the window and seeing what everybody else is doing, but very few of us actually take time to look in the mirror and reflect on what we're doing or projecting out there. So, like I said, use your voice, but if it doesn't work, have a look at why, address those issues. Don't be afraid to ask for feedback as well, I think is another important one. And probably I've been coined a few times as a bit of an agitator in women's sport. I like the word agitator. I think I was agitating my parents and teachers all throughout my childhood. And it's obviously an attribute that I've learned to use for good, I hope, as I now am in my mid-40s. But something I say to my daughter is, if the door isn't opening, kick it down. And if you're in any circumstantial situation where there's an unjust or detrimental cause and effect equation to any cross-section of society, whether that's, women, ethnic, disabilities, positive activism is the way. And I use the word positive for emphasis. Positive activism. Don't set the door on fire, but do kick it down.
I love that. And what you said with the agitator, I like that as well. It's often I hear when there is a woman that, raises her voice or wants to speak her mind and is, knows what she wants, then sometimes she's described as loud or annoying or
obnoxious,
obnoxious.
Self-centered.
Yeah, exactly. But when a man does it, he's, he know what
assertive.
He wants and he's assertive. Yeah, exactly. So I like that. And positive activism. We don't want to throw tomato juice on things and glue
eggs.
yourself to exactly.
That's not going to go down well.
Exactly.
Positive activism.
I love that. Has there been any bumps on the road in your career? And if so, how did you overcome them?
There have been multiple bumps on the road in my career. I've overcome them all through a combination of factors, I think. You've got to have a strong support network who believe in you and back you and believe in your ability, and you've got that encouragement. And, like I said, I'm a mum, I have a daughter. One of the biggest bumps in the road for me has been being a working mother in a high-pressured career and in a profession that we have the same issues on a very smaller scale at management level, oftentimes in law firms that we've talked about in football. Those have been big challenges, big challenges. Determination is another thing, that sort of focus on, I believe in what it is that I'm setting out to do. I know I have the ability and I know I can do it. I am forever grateful for every naysayer I've ever encountered on my journey, because when you tell me I can't do something or you don't believe in me, I promise you I'm going to go and do it and write a book about it on the other side at some point. Use the negativity to fuel your fire. Use it to drive you on. Prove them wrong.
Love that. I hope that everyone was listening and taking notes. And if not, go back and listen again, because that was pure gold.
Thank you, Marcus.
Before I let you go, the last question that I ask everyone is, who from your network do you think would be a good guest for this podcast?
This was an easy question for me to think about. One of my contacts and good friends, Yvonne Harrison, she is the CEO of Women in Football, the organization. They have a website, they've got LinkedIn profiles. What they are doing for women in football is absolutely incredible, amazing, raising awareness, funding research and insight, not just from statistics as to what's going on in the world, but looking at science-backed research that we're talking about with ACL injuries and, hormonal issues that women face in the game. But she's got a really interesting background, Yvonne. She's very passionate about equality, as you would expect the CEO of Women in Football to be. But that spans kind of from grassroots all the way up to boardroom. She's got 20 years experience in the sports industry. I think what I found really impressive about Yvonne, apart from the fact that on a personal level, she's so fun and so affable, and just a genuinely great person to be around, was that she was director of Project 92, which was the founded by the Manchester United class of 92. And during her tenure there as director, the Project 92 saw the creation and development of the United Academy, the University Academy 92, which are now obviously a higher education institution here in Manchester. So she's got some really good stories, and as I say, she's so passionate. So she's very inspiring to listen to, but also a nice person to chat with, I think.
I'm sure it sounds really interesting. And what you mentioned at the beginning, I recently read an article from Women's Health magazine, I think, about that with ACL injuries and what can, I think there are only 6% of the studies that have been doing on health has been specifically on women's health when it comes to sports.
Yeah.
And that now we have so many ACL injuries, and what does it depend on? And they mentioned so many possibilities that could be, you said, hormonal, but also that the women's game has gotten so much better quickly. So they, and they don't maybe have the proper training for so much workouts. And, it just, it's a science.
I mean, it's a combination of things, but when you break it down to science, it's really basic, I think, because women's feet are shaped differently. We have bigger arches than men. That's just science. That's just biology. So how are our feet supposed to fit into football boots that are designed scientifically for men? Women run differently. We have a different gait. It's science, isn't it? And as you say, that's inevitably going to lead to more ACL injuries. So as I said before, we could talk for days.
Yes, for sure.
But I hope that the future looks bright, provided that, that positive optimism that I've banged on about for almost the entirety of this podcast. As long as that is followed and we get some really good people at board level, Yvonne being one of them, who I've suggested, you get onto the podcast, that we get some really good commercial strategies in place, and we can keep reinvesting in the game.
So let's use this as a teaser for a possible future episode with Yvonne.
Yes.
And I thank you so much, Niki, for taking the time today to be on the Sports Management Podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Marcus. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @SportsMPodcast.